Hello, and welcome to All Our Little Messes, a podcast focused on healing through intentional conversations about parenting, relationships, religion, and more. I am your host, Veronica Winrod, and I'm so happy to have you here, listening in on my thoughts today. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to All Our Little Messes. Today we're going to be talking about something that I feel is starting to become more of a focal point in Christian influencers and things like that. But I feel it needs to be talked about more, and I have myself experienced, I would say some of the aspects of this belief and this mindset. So we're going to talk a little bit about obligation sex today and its impacts on Christian and Catholic marriages, and also where it came from. From what I have seen and what I've read inside of marriage books that I was given when I got married and things like that, it really seems to be a direct result of purity culture and just like a natural progression from purity culture into marriage. And so, I just wanted to talk about that while we're, continuing on our series about purity culture. I wanted to address the obligation sex within marriages, because again, purity culture doesn't cease to exist after we get married. There are just certain teachings around purity culture just change for us, essentially, those of us that are married. And so obligation sex is just one of those teachings. And so basically what obligation sex is it's actually based on 1 Corinthians 7:5, where it says, "Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent." And so a lot of Christians, and Catholics, especially more of the Catholics of the more traditional mindset and more fundamentalist Christians, they take that as do not deprive your husband, because there's this generally accepted belief that women do not need or enjoy sex. And so when we see that verse, a lot of people take that as do not deprive your husbands. And so we're taught, girls are taught kind of indirectly, subconsciously, about the obligation to satisfy your husbands. We're kind of taught that concept from a very young age without ever being really explicit about it. It's through very, very subtle things within purity culture. Just the thing, messaging, boys think about sex every seven minutes or something like that. I was always told that men think about sex every 7 minutes, and or that we have to dress a certain way in order to protect boys because they're constantly thinking about sex, or that we have to protect ourselves from boys because they just can't help themselves, right? And so there's this subconscious messaging from the time we're very, very young that boys need sex and that we're the gatekeepers to it. And so then when we get married, then all of a sudden this sex is allowed, and we're just supposed to give it to them. And so this teaching that we are the gatekeepers to sexual morality, one, subconsciously also does teach us that our bodies, one, are sinful. They're inherently sinful. And also that they're not our own. Our bodies are not our own. And because, someone is always trying to take it from us. So after marriage, we've been taught our entire lives that our bodies do not belong to us. And so we grow up thinking our bodies are sinful, we must hide them, someone's always trying to take them because, it's theirs, that kind of thing. And then we get married and we are told in all of these marriage books, and I could actually name quite a few where I've read this. Love and Respect, Every Man's Battle. You have the series of books For His Eyes Only, For Her Eyes Only. A lot of these books all say, or Created to Be His Helpmeet. That's also a really big one when it comes to this. They all say the same thing. Men need sex, and basically women are there to provide it. And so women become a commodity after marriage, and our bodies are there to be used for our husbands because our husbands need sex and we are there to provide it, essentially. And so through that messaging, we are taught that our bodies do not belong to us. And more than that, like they'll start using 1 Corinthians to justify that position. And if you're saying no for any reason, basically you're depriving your husbands. And which is it's really sad because like it strips a woman of her bodily autonomy in marriage. Like it strips her of her dignity, and it's so harmful and cheapening and degrading to be told that your husband needs sex and you were there to provide that sexual pleasure. Not that he is giving a gift of himself to you and you are giving a gift of yourself to him and sharing in this incredibly close emotional and physical bond. No, he has a need and you have to provide it. And that's all that sex is. And so you can never say no. You can never say no because, 1 Corinthians says, do not deprive each other. And if you say no, you're depriving him of this need that he is, you're obligated to provide. He is entitled to it. He is entitled to your body. And so, and I believe I mentioned this, in an earlier podcast episode where in, the early days of my marriage, I never said no because I had been raised with that mentality of you can't say no. Like all of the books I was given after I got married all told me that I could never say no to my husband. And I believed it because they also said, and like I had other married women like affirm this, it was sinful. I would be sinning. I would be committing a mortal sin if I deprived my husband. So if he asked for it, or if he showed any kind of sexual advances or anything like that, and I said no, I'm not interested, I was sinning against him and against God and against myself. And so sex was hard sometimes, a lot of times for me because, during that first year, especially first 2 years of marriage, I was pregnant. And then after that, the second year I had my first child. And so I was learning how to navigate motherhood for the first time and navigating, learning how to breastfeed and all of our first child had some medical problems. And so I was navigating all of these medical problems and things. And then on top of that, I also had this messaging of, whenever your husband needs it, you have to say yes. And there was also, this shame attached to talking about that. I felt guilty over not wanting to have sex sometimes and wanting to say no. And I felt like that was bad. I had to want it at all times. When he said it, I had to want it, even though I was tired or I felt sick or I was just absolutely touched out because I had a 9-month-old baby that just needed me all the time. I could never just say, no, I'm tired. Can we do it tomorrow instead? And so I felt like I couldn't express that to him either because, again, there was like so much shame and guilt attached to that because I felt like even, wanting to say no, even though I wasn't, even wanting to say no was sinful. And so like it took me years, honestly, to move past that and like be able to share with him, hey, this is what's going on. Like, I don't always want to have sex. And like, he was shocked because he thought I did. But I had been raised and hardwired to be that way, to be the willing, submissive wife at all times, ready for sex with a smile whenever he wants it, always be sexually available. And, and the obligation sex, and it went even beyond that. I mean, I felt like if I told him no, then, because men think about sex every 7 minutes and that's all they want and that's why they get married. And I had a man tell me that the only reason why a man gets married is so that he can have sex. And like, even though my husband would tell me multiple times that is not why he got married to me, like that is not why he married me, I had a really, really hard time believing it. Like, it was very difficult for me to believe it because, like, again, I had been hardwired to think that the only thing a man cared about, the only thing boys cared about was sex and what I looked like and what I could give them. And so that whole culture surrounding, men needing sex and then, women are never allowed to say no. Like, I felt like if I did say no because of this huge need, supposed need that he has for sex at all times, if I said no, he would, start watching porn or he'd cheat on me. He'd go to someone else for his sexual satisfaction. Like, these were actual legitimate thoughts that were running through my head all the time. And so, and it took me a very long time to get over that and to understand that, like, it's okay. We actually are allowed to say no. Me saying no for a night is not depriving my husband. And not only that, women are allowed, like, the whole messaging behind obligation sex and the fact that, it's sex is this thing that men need and women can provide. The whole the messaging behind that is just so harmful and messed up to me because it basically turns men into like these animals that just can't help themselves, and they just have like this primal need that they just cannot control. They can't control themselves, and turns women into like this commodity or sexual objects to be used by men whenever they have this urge, right? And it completely ignores the fact, and it feeds back into, the idea in purity culture that women do not need or enjoy sex. It feeds back into that idea that women do not need or enjoy sex. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, the way that men and women approach sex is definitely very, very different. Like, the way women approach sex is very emotional. Like, we have a very emotional approach to it. We have to be emotionally connected, emotionally fulfilled. Like, there's so many facets to it before we can have like a truly enjoyable sexual experience. And so, yeah, like the ways that men and women approach sex is very different, but that does not mean that just because we approach sex differently than men, that does not mean that we do not enjoy it. And that is like the messaging behind obligation sex, is that we have to provide it at the drop of a hat without any, without any effort for fulfillment on our husband's parts. And so it becomes this job, this chore on our to-do list every day that we just check off, and oh shoot, I forgot, I have to do a load of laundry, and then after that I have to have sex with my husband, and then I need to remember to do the dishes. And it's just like it's a long list of laws, right? When in fact, and it's not, it's something that we dread, and we never look forward to. Like I couldn't even imagine that. Like, I personally hate doing laundry. It is like the worst to me. If I could, I would put it off forever. I cannot imagine now I can't. I cannot imagine putting sex on my to-do list for the day and treating it and thinking of it as this thing that I had to do. I couldn't put it off, but I just, I needed to do it and get it over with. Like that load of laundry that I just have to do. It's just so weird to me. But unfortunately, a lot of women in Christianity and within like Catholic cultures, view sex that way. And it really comes back to this whole idea of obligation sex. And that men are entitled to us, and men are entitled to our bodies. And, when you read the whole verse of 1 Corinthians 7:5, it never explicitly mentions either men or women. It's actually talking about both of them. And I thought that was very interesting, because to me, it shows that it is a need for both the husband and the wife, not just the husband. And so it is both of our jobs to approach the sexual relationship and fulfill each other's needs. Like my husband has, he has more physical needs. And I mean, he also has emotional, he's a human being, so he also has emotional needs as well. And so, and especially when you're, within, when you're married, sex becomes a very emotional thing. It's how, a married couple, like a healthy married couple, emotionally connects. But that's especially true for a woman. Like, she has to feel safe. She has to feel taken care of. She has to be emotionally fulfilled. She needs to feel heard and understood. And like her husband actually cares about her. And if that emotional connection with her husband, that spiritual connection, I should call it actually, if that connection with her husband isn't there, then sex really it's an obligation. It's a chore. It's just something that she needs to check off on her to-do list, and it doesn't fulfill the biblical requirements of sex. Like 1 Corinthians 7:5 says, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. He's talking to both of us. And, while women may have, we're not necessarily going to be tempted sexually. But if we do not come together with our husbands and both of us, take care of each other in the ways that we need, then Satan will tempt us in our unique ways. And so, he will tempt us emotionally. If we cannot get that emotional connection that we need in order to fulfill during sex, if we cannot get that, then we're going to seek it elsewhere, because women really do need that emotional connection. Like, it's just, it's in our natures. We need it. And so if we cannot get that from our husbands, we are going to seek it elsewhere through, friends or, worst case scenario, God forbid, outside of, the bounds of marriage. And so, like, this verse is very important, but I feel like people really misconstrue it to mean the wife cannot deprive the husband, and that's all it is about. And it is so not about that. It is about more than just sex. And I feel like people need to really read and study that verse and try to come to a better understanding, in my opinion, because I feel like a lot of problems could be avoided, especially in the early years of marriage, if, this was actually something that was talked about in marriage classes and stuff, which, I actually can't speak to marriage counseling and marriage classes nowadays, because the marriage counseling I was provided with before I got married was very, very minimal. It was a 3-hour crash course the day before I got married, by a priest who did not even end up marrying us. And basically, when it came to 1 Corinthians 7:5, like, the counseling and advice I received surrounding that was, don't say no. You can't deprive him. So you can't say no. And that was my marriage advice when it came to sex. And so it was, which, further, I had a priest telling me, you can't say no. So it further, like, solidified in my mind that it was a sin. And I would be, causing us both to sin if I ever said no. And so, like, very rarely would I do it. Like, I would have to be, basically dying in order for me to say no. Like, I remember after my first child, traditionally you're supposed to wait 6 weeks, right? You're supposed to wait 6 weeks to make sure your body's healed and to make sure that there is not any risk for infection and all that stuff, right? After you have a child. I did not do that. Neither one of us really were told about the whole 6-week thing, and I didn't even really think about it. And so it wasn't too soon, but it was fairly soon after childbirth. We were talking about it, and he asked, and I didn't really feel comfortable because I had just, given birth, and I was just, like, dead tired all the time. But again, you can't say no. No is never an answer. Like, you can't, it's not even something that should enter your mind. So it's like, oh, yes, of course. And, looking back, and I'm just like, oh my goodness. Like, both of us had such a twisted understanding of healthy boundaries in marriage at that point. And, like, I didn't have an understanding of what I was and wasn't allowed to do biblically. And so again, like, I felt like if I ever said no for any reason, I was, committing a sin, and now I'd have to confess the sin. And so it was like growing up like that was just, and going into marriage like that was just so harmful and so emotionally exhausting all the time. And it really twisted my idea of what a healthy sex life in a marriage should be like. And, like, the more I've talked to women within Christianity and within Catholicism, like traditional Catholicism, I find that it's actually a very common occurrence. Like, this is very, very common for girls to be raised with this idea that we can't say no. It is a sin to say no. Our bodies do not belong to us. We have no rights over them at all. Like, none, zero, nada, ever, even after childbirth. And so, and that creates, a whole host of other problems, which we can get into in a later podcast. But yeah, it's so sad. And it's just so harmful. And it's created really this epidemic of marriages where there's like this power dynamic that really oftentimes, the husband isn't even aware exists. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, a wife feels shame and guilt that she has these feelings of, feeling obligated to have sex with her husband when she doesn't want to. She feels shame and guilt that it's a chore and she doesn't want it. But she won't talk about it. And so like there's like this odd power dynamic that neither one of them is really aware exists within the marriage. And it affects the marriage in all areas, not just in, the sexual relationship, but it affects them in all areas. And like, in order for a marriage to be, truly healthy, you need to be able to communicate those kinds of feelings to your husband. And you need to know that, you're going to be heard and you're going to be emotionally safe. And like, a woman needs that. And in a lot of cases, a woman doesn't know that when she's raised with, the obligation sex message. And when she's raised with impurity culture, she's taught that her voice does not matter and her body is not her own. And so she never feels like she can actually speak up and say, I don't like this and I want this to change. And so like, I feel like our first steps to break out of this cycle of obligation sex and, purity culture is to start teaching our girls that you do have a voice. If someone, just like basic things, like, if someone is touching you that you don't like, even if it's just a hug or just, they just want to give you a hug, it's okay to say no because your body is your own. No is a complete sentence. No is an answer, even when you're married. And that starts with teaching our girls from a very young age. And I'm talking young toddlers, as young as when they start talking, learning how to speak. Start teaching them, bodily autonomy and how to say no, and that their bodies are their own, and teach them healthy boundaries.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of All Our Little Messes. Please let us know how much you enjoyed it below and add any questions you have about this episode. Also, don't forget to follow us on Patreon for amazing exclusive perks, including early access to podcast episodes and bonus episodes every month. We've also recently added a support group for all of our paid patrons. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram for daily updates and insights that mirror podcast topics. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.